I remember the exact moment the laughter started. It began as a quiet chuckle somewhere in the back of the courtroom, the kind people try to hide behind their hands, but it didn't stay quiet for long. Within seconds, the entire room joined in, a low wave of amusement rolling across the wooden benches and echoing against the high ceiling. All because of me. Or more precisely, because of what I was wearing. A faded blue janitor's uniform, slightly wrinkled from a long shift, with a small plastic badge clipped near my chest that simply read, Daniel, Facilities. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was packed that morning. A civil hearing like this usually didn't draw a crowd, but family disputes over property had a way of attracting curious spectators. Lawyers whispered to each other, clerks shuffled papers, and a few reporters leaned forward in their seats. But none of them were looking at the judge. They were all looking at me. I stood quietly beside the old man who had asked me to come with him that morning. Harold Whitaker was 72 years old, with thin silver hair and a posture that carried the slow weight of time. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the sleeve of his brown coat, but his eyes were steady. He had built a small construction supply company decades ago, the kind of family business that paid for college tuition and Sunday dinners. Now he stood in court defending the right to keep it. The judge, Margaret Collins, sat high behind the polished bench, her glasses resting low on her nose as she scanned the paperwork in front of her. She looked up after a moment, her expression neutral but curious. Mr. Whitaker, she said calmly, the court record shows that you've chosen to represent yourself today. Is that correct? Harold slowly turned his head toward me. The movement was deliberate, almost gentle. Then he lifted his hand and pointed directly at me. No, Your Honor, he said softly. He's representing me. For a moment the courtroom was completely silent. Judge Collins blinked once, then twice, as if she thought she had misheard him. Her eyes shifted toward me, taking in the janitor uniform, the worn shoes, the faint smell of cleaning solution that still clung to my sleeves. Sir, she said carefully, are you an attorney? I didn't answer right away. Before I could even open my mouth, the opposing counsel let out a loud laugh. Victor Langston was the kind of lawyer who wore confidence like a tailored suit. Tall, sharp jawline, perfectly pressed charcoal jacket, and the unmistakable smirk of a man who believed he had already won. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. Your Honor, Langston said between chuckles, are we really doing this today? A janitor representing a defendant in a civil property dispute. The room erupted again. Someone in the back muttered something about courtroom entertainment. A woman near the aisle covered her mouth as she laughed. Even one of the clerks struggled to keep a straight face. Harold didn't laugh. He simply stood there beside me, his shoulders relaxed, as if he had expected exactly this reaction. Judge Collins raised her hand for silence. Order in the court, she said firmly. The laughter faded, though a few lingering smiles remained. Her gaze settled on me again. Sir, she repeated, I need a clear answer. Are you representing Mr. Whitaker in this case? I met her eyes across the room. Yes, Your Honor, I said calmly. A quiet ripple moved through the benches again, though this time it wasn't quite laughter. More like disbelief. Victor Langston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he studied me with open amusement. Well, he said slowly, this should be interesting. He turned toward Harold with a grin that barely hid his confidence. Mr. Whitaker, I hope you understand the seriousness of this hearing. Your grandson is asking the court to determine that you are no longer capable of managing your financial affairs. That includes the house you've lived in for 40 years and the company you built. Harold nodded once. I understand. Langston gestured toward me again. And this is the man you've chosen to defend you? Harold's voice remained calm. Yes. Langston smiled wider, shaking his head like a man watching an inevitable outcome unfold. Then by all means, he said lightly, leaning back in his chair, let's see what the janitor has to say. I didn't react. I didn't look at the crowd. I didn't respond to the laughter still lingering in the air. I simply placed a thin folder on the table in front of me, opened it slowly, and glanced down at the documents inside. Because the truth was, the laughter didn't bother me at all. In fact, I had been expecting it. Victor Langston adjusted the cuff of his suit as if the entire situation had already become a minor inconvenience in his day. The confidence in his posture was almost theatrical. He slowly stood from his chair and walked a few steps toward the center of the courtroom, turning just enough so the judge and the spectators could see his expression clearly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Before we begin, I would like the record to reflect that the opposing representative appears to be a maintenance employee of this building." A few quiet chuckles slipped through the benches again. Judge Collins did not smile. She simply looked down at the papers in front of her and then back at me. "Sir," she said carefully, "the court must confirm that anyone presenting arguments understands the proceedings. This is a legal matter involving financial authority and property ownership. Do you understand that?" I nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." My voice was calm, steady, and unhurried. The judge studied me for a moment longer before turning toward Harold. "Mr. Whitaker, this hearing concerns a petition filed by your grandson claiming that you are no longer capable of managing your business or your personal property. If the court agrees with that claim, control of your assets may be transferred. Do you still wish to proceed with this arrangement?" Harold lifted his chin slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." Langston exhaled a quiet laugh and returned to his table. He gathered a stack of neatly organized documents and placed them in front of him with deliberate precision. "Very well," he said, almost cheerfully. "Then let us begin with something simple." He glanced toward the gallery where a young man in an expensive jacket sat waiting. Ethan Whitaker looked barely 30, with perfectly styled hair and the restless impatience of someone who believed success should arrive quickly. Langston gestured toward him. "Your Honor, the petitioner would like to clarify that this action was not filed out of greed or hostility toward his grandfather. He simply believes Mr. Whitaker deserves rest after decades of work." Ethan nodded solemnly, though the expression looked practiced. "I only want what is best for him," he said. "My grandfather has worked his entire life. He should not have to worry about contracts or financial decisions anymore." Langston stepped closer to the bench. "Exactly. The family company now operates multiple warehouses and supply contracts across 3 counties. Managing it requires sharp attention and modern knowledge of the market. Mr. Whitaker is 72 years old. It is natural for the next generation to step in." Several people in the courtroom nodded quietly. The argument sounded reasonable on the surface. Langston continued, pacing slowly as he spoke. "We have financial records showing irregular decisions made over the past year. Missed meetings. Delayed responses. Confusion regarding supplier agreements. These are not accusations. They are simply facts." He paused and turned toward Harold with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Whitaker deserves comfort, not pressure. My client only wishes to take responsibility so his grandfather can enjoy his remaining years peacefully." The words hung in the air for a moment. Judge Collins made a small note on her pad. Then she looked toward me. "Do you wish to respond?" The room grew quiet again. I did not rush to speak. Instead, I closed the folder in front of me and rested both hands on the table. Victor Langston watched me with open amusement, clearly expecting confusion or hesitation. Instead, I simply asked one question. "May I speak directly to the petitioner, Your Honor?" Langston lifted an eyebrow, already smiling. Judge Collins considered it briefly before nodding. "You may." I turned toward Ethan Whitaker. The young man shifted slightly in his seat, though the confidence had not left his face. "Mr. Whitaker," I said calmly, "you mentioned your grandfather has been making irregular decisions recently. Could you help the court understand something?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Of course." I held his gaze. "Exactly when did you begin preparing the paperwork to take control of his company?" The smile on his face paused for just a fraction of a second. It was small, almost invisible, but it was the first moment that something in the courtroom shifted. The pause on Ethan Whitaker's face lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for anyone who was paying attention to notice it. He quickly leaned back in his chair and forced a small laugh as if the question had amused him more than anything else. "I am not sure what you mean," he said casually. "My attorney handled most of the paperwork." Victor Langston nodded immediately as though the answer had already been rehearsed. "That is correct," he added smoothly. "My client consulted me once it became clear that Mr. Whitaker was struggling to manage certain responsibilities. We simply acted in his best interest." I nodded slowly, as if the explanation made perfect sense. Then I glanced down at the folder in front of me and opened it again with calm, deliberate movements. Papers slid quietly across the table as I searched for a particular page. The room had grown noticeably quieter. The earlier laughter had faded into a careful silence. Judge Collins leaned slightly forward in her chair, watching the exchange with the alert patience of someone waiting to see where a conversation might lead. I lifted one document from the folder and held it between my fingers. "Mr. Whitaker," I said, still looking at Ethan. "Do you remember a meeting that took place last November at the Riverside Business Cafe on Oak Street?" Ethan blinked. The confidence on his face returned quickly, but his shoulders shifted slightly as he adjusted his position. "I meet people all the time," he replied. "You will have to be more specific." I nodded again, completely unbothered. "Of course. It was a Tuesday afternoon at approximately 3:30. You were sitting with two individuals from a private investment group. The meeting lasted about 40 minutes. Victor Langston straightened a little in his chair, the easy smile on his face fading into something more cautious. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I am not sure how this is relevant to the question of Mr. Whitaker's capacity to manage his business." Judge Collins raised a hand without looking away from me. "Let him finish." Langston closed his mouth, but did not look pleased. I returned my attention to Ethan. "During that meeting," I continued, "you discussed the possibility of selling controlling shares of your grandfather's company to that investment group. In exchange, you would receive an executive position once the transfer was complete." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "That is completely inaccurate," he said quickly. "I never agreed to anything like that." I held the paper up just enough for the judge to see the heading at the top. "This appears to be the meeting summary sent from one of the investors the following morning," I said calmly. "It confirms that negotiations had already begun." A faint murmur moved through the spectators in the courtroom. Victor Langston stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is speculation. Anyone could have written that document." Judge Collins turned toward me again. "Do you have proof of its authenticity?" I placed the document back on the table and reached into the folder once more. "Yes, Your Honor." I slid another sheet across the table toward the clerk, who carried it up to the bench. The judge adjusted her glasses and read quietly for a few seconds. Her expression changed very slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for someone who had spent years watching people in difficult moments to recognize that something important had shifted. She looked up again. "Mr. Whitaker," she said to Ethan, "this appears to be an email from your personal account confirming that meeting." Ethan's face went pale for a moment before he recovered. "That does not prove anything," he insisted. "I was only exploring options for the future." I folded my hands calmly on the table. "That future appears to have started several months before you claimed your grandfather was incapable of running his own company." The room fell completely silent. Even Victor Langston no longer looked amused. For the first time since the hearing began, he was studying me with careful attention, as if he had finally realized that the man standing in a janitor's uniform might know far more than anyone in the room had expected. Victor Langston no longer leaned back in his chair. The relaxed confidence he had displayed earlier had faded into something more careful, more measured. He adjusted the papers on the table in front of him, but this time the movement felt less like control and more like hesitation. The entire courtroom had grown quiet enough that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than before. Judge Collins looked down at the email again, then placed it gently on the bench. "Mr. Whitaker," she said to Ethan, her tone calm but firm, "this document suggests that discussions about selling your grandfather's company began several months before this petition was filed. Can you explain that timeline to the court?" Ethan cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. His earlier confidence had not disappeared completely, but it now seemed strained around the edges. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "exploring business opportunities is not illegal. I was simply thinking ahead. My grandfather built a good company, but the market is changing. Investors were interested in helping it grow." Victor Langston stepped forward quickly, clearly eager to regain control of the narrative. "That is exactly right," he said smoothly. "Forward thinking should not be interpreted as wrongdoing. My client was preparing for a future transition. That is a responsible thing to do." Judge Collins nodded slightly, but did not look convinced. Her eyes shifted toward me again. "Do you have anything further to present?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached back into the folder and removed another document, sliding it slowly across the table so the clerk could deliver it to the bench. The movement was calm and deliberate, the same steady pace I had used since the hearing began. Victor Langston watched the paper travel across the room with narrowed eyes. Judge Collins adjusted her glasses once more and began reading. This time it took a little longer. The silence stretched across the courtroom. A few spectators leaned forward slightly, sensing that something important was unfolding. Finally, the judge looked up again. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough that the tension in the room grew noticeably heavier. "Mr. Whitaker," she said to Ethan, "this appears to be a preliminary agreement drafted by the investment group mentioned earlier. According to this document, you would receive an executive position and a financial bonus if the controlling shares of the company were transferred within 6 months." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Victor Langston spoke before he could respond. "Your Honor, a draft agreement proves nothing. Businesses create drafts all the time during negotiations. It does not mean a deal was finalized." I nodded slightly. "That is correct," I said calmly. "But the timeline is important." Judge Collins looked at me with quiet interest. I continued. "The meeting with the investors took place in November. The draft agreement was created 2 days later. And this petition claiming that Harold Whitaker was incapable of managing his own company was filed in January." The courtroom remained perfectly still. Even Ethan seemed unsure how to react. I rested my hands lightly on the table and looked directly at him again. "That means the plan to transfer ownership began before anyone ever suggested that your grandfather was unable to make decisions." Ethan's jaw tightened as he leaned forward. "That is not what happened," he said quickly. "You are twisting things around." Victor Langston straightened his tie and forced a small, controlled smile. "Your Honor, with respect, we are allowing a maintenance worker to speculate about complex legal matters. My client's intentions were to protect his grandfather from the pressures of running a large company." I met Langston's gaze for the first time since the hearing began. "Then perhaps we should ask Mr. Whitaker one simple question," I said quietly. Judge Collins raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." I turned toward Ethan once more. "If your only goal was to protect your grandfather," I asked calmly, "why did the draft agreement list you as the new chief executive officer instead of an independent manager?" The question landed in the center of the room like a dropped coin in a quiet hall. Ethan stared at me without answering. For the first time since the hearing had begun, the confidence in his eyes was gone, replaced by something far less certain. And across the table, Victor Langston no longer looked amused at all. For several seconds, Ethan Whitaker said nothing. His eyes moved from me to the judge, and then briefly toward Victor Langston, as if searching for the answer somewhere else in the room. The silence stretched long enough that the spectators in the courtroom began shifting quietly in their seats. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "That was just a proposal," he said quickly. "Investors always want someone from the family involved. That does not mean I plan to take anything away from my grandfather." Victor Langston nodded immediately, stepping forward with renewed energy, as though he had found solid ground again. "Exactly," he said. "The document only shows that outside investors believed Mr. Whitaker's grandson could help modernize the company. That is hardly evidence of manipulation." Judge Collins rested her pen against the bench and studied both men carefully. Her voice remained calm, but carried a tone of quiet authority that settled over the room. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "but the timing still raises questions." I did not interrupt. I simply allowed the moment to settle before reaching once more into the folder in front of me. The sound of paper sliding across the table seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. Victor Langston watched my hands now with far more attention than before. I lifted a small stack of documents and placed them neatly on the table. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "may I ask the petitioner another question?" Judge Collins nodded once. "You may." I turned again toward Ethan Whitaker. His earlier confidence had not returned. The expression on his face was tight now, cautious, as though he had begun to realize that the hearing was not unfolding the way he expected. "Mr. Whitaker," I said quietly, "you mentioned that your grandfather has been making poor decisions recently. Is that correct?" Ethan nodded quickly. "Yes, that is exactly why we are here." I tilted my head slightly. "Can you give the court a specific example?" Ethan hesitated. "Well, he delayed renewing a supplier contract last fall." Victor Langston leaned forward as if encouraging him to continue. "That delay cost the company money," Ethan added quickly. "It showed he was not keeping up with the business." I nodded thoughtfully and picked up one of the documents from the stack. "The contract with North River Materials," I said calmly. "Signed originally in 2009. Renewed every 5 years." Ethan blinked. "Yes, that is the one." I slid the document toward the clerk so it could be delivered to the judge. According to these records, I continued, the renewal meeting was postponed by 2 weeks last October. Judge Collins glanced down at the paper. I see that. Ethan straightened slightly, clearly believing the point had been proven. Exactly, he said. That delay is the kind of mistake that hurts a company. I folded my hands again and looked directly at him. Do you know why the meeting was postponed? Ethan opened his mouth and then paused. Because my grandfather forgot about it, he said after a moment. The courtroom remained quiet. Judge Collins looked up from the document again. I allowed a small pause before speaking. Actually, I said calmly, the meeting was postponed because Harold Whitaker discovered that North River Materials had quietly increased their shipping rates by 15%. Ethan's face stiffened. I continued in the same steady tone. Instead of renewing the contract immediately, he spent 2 weeks negotiating with 3 competing suppliers. The final agreement reduced material costs by 8% across the next 3 years. Judge Collins looked back down at the document and then at the additional pages that followed it. These numbers appear to confirm that, she said quietly. A low murmur moved through the courtroom again. Ethan stared at the table in front of him, clearly caught off guard. Victor Langston's expression hardened slightly as he realized the direction the conversation was heading. I remained completely still. So when you described that delay as a mistake, I said calmly, what you were actually describing was a negotiation that saved the company several $100,000. The room fell silent once more. And this time, no one was laughing anymore. The quiet that followed felt heavier than anything earlier in the hearing. Ethan Whitaker stared at the table as though the numbers written on those documents might somehow change if he looked at them long enough. Victor Langston slowly sat down, the confident rhythm of his movements gone now, replaced by a careful stillness. Judge Collins leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers resting together as she observed the room. Mr. Whitaker, she said calmly to Ethan, do you still believe your grandfather is incapable of making sound business decisions? Ethan shifted in his seat again. Your Honor, that was only one example, he said quickly. There have been others. His voice carried less certainty than before. Langston rose again, though this time his tone was more measured. Your Honor, isolated financial outcomes do not necessarily prove long-term competence. Age can affect judgment in unpredictable ways. That is why my client filed this petition. He is concerned about the overall direction of the company. Judge Collins nodded slightly. Then perhaps the court should examine the overall direction. Her eyes moved toward me again. Do you have additional records? I did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder again and removed a thicker packet of papers. I placed it on the table with quiet precision. The edges of the documents were neatly aligned, the pages carefully organized. Victor Langston watched them as if they might contain something far more troublesome than the earlier papers. These, I said calmly, are the company's quarterly financial reports from the past 3 years. The clerk carried them to the bench. Judge Collins began turning the pages slowly. As she read, her expression remained neutral, but the length of time she spent reviewing the documents told its own story. Several spectators leaned forward again, sensing that the hearing had shifted into deeper water. Finally, the judge looked up. According to these reports, she said, revenue increased steadily over the past 3 years. She flipped another page. Profit margins also improved. Victor. Langston cleared his throat. Markets fluctuate, Your Honor. That does not mean. The judge raised her hand gently, stopping him before he finished. She continued reading. In fact, the company appears to have expanded its supply contracts during the same period. The room remained silent as she set the documents down. Mr. Whitaker, she said to Ethan, these records suggest that the business has been performing quite well under your grandfather's leadership. Ethan forced a tight smile. Those numbers were influenced by my ideas as well, he said quickly. I have been helping him for years. I nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the statement. That is true, I said calmly. You have been present at many meetings. Ethan seemed relieved to hear that agreement. Victor Langston leaned forward again, eager to reinforce the point. Exactly. My client has played an important role in supporting his grandfather. I waited a moment before speaking again. But presence and leadership are not the same thing. The words settled quietly into the room. I reached back into the folder and removed another sheet. This one was shorter, printed on plain white paper. Your Honor, I said, sliding it across the table. This is a list of every contract signed by the company during the last 24 months. Judge Collins accepted the paper and studied it carefully. After a moment, she looked up again. All of these contracts appear to carry the same signature, she said. Harold Whitaker. I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Ethan's shoulders stiffened slightly. Judge Collins continued, her tone thoughtful. There are no signatures from the petitioner. That is correct, I replied calmly. A faint murmur spread through the gallery again. The implication was becoming difficult to ignore. Ethan Whitaker had described himself as the person protecting the company's future. But the documents told a simpler story. Every major decision, every negotiation, every agreement, they had all been signed by the same steady hand. The hand of the 72-year-old man standing quietly beside me. Harold Whitaker did not say anything during that moment. He simply stood there with the same calm posture he had held since the hearing began. Judge Collins closed the folder slowly and looked across the courtroom. So far, she said carefully, the evidence presented suggests that Mr. Whitaker has been running his company quite effectively. Victor Langston did not respond right away. His eyes had moved back to me again, studying me with a new kind of attention. The kind a lawyer gives someone who might be far more dangerous than they first appeared. And in that quiet moment, it became clear that the laughter from earlier in the hearing had disappeared completely. Victor Langston remained standing for a moment after the judge finished speaking, but he no longer seemed eager to address the court. The easy rhythm he had carried earlier in the hearing had disappeared. Instead, he adjusted the front of his suit slowly, as if buying time to think. The silence in the courtroom felt deliberate now. Every person in the gallery seemed aware that the balance of the hearing had shifted. Judge Collins rested her hands on the bench and looked toward Ethan Whitaker again. Mr. Whitaker, she said calmly, so far the evidence presented does not support the claim that your grandfather has been incapable of managing his business. In fact, the records suggest quite the opposite. Ethan swallowed and forced a small smile that did not look comfortable. Your Honor, I still believe my grandfather needs help. Running a company today is different than it was 20 years ago. Technology changes everything. Victor Langston nodded slightly, stepping forward again. That is a fair point, he said carefully. The issue here is not whether Mr. Whitaker once ran the company successfully. The issue is whether he can continue doing so moving forward. Judge Collins tilted her head slightly. And what evidence do you have that he cannot? Langston paused. For the first time since the hearing began, he did not immediately have an answer ready. His eyes drifted toward me again, studying the janitor uniform, the calm posture, the quiet patience with which I had spoken throughout the morning. When he spoke again, his tone was more cautious. Your Honor, I must ask the court a question before we proceed further. Judge Collins gestured lightly. Go ahead. Langston turned toward me fully now. Sir, he said, his voice polite but sharp underneath. You have presented financial records, contract histories, and internal documents belonging to the Whitaker Supply Company. Those materials would not normally be available to someone who works as building maintenance. Would you care to explain how you obtained them? The question lingered in the air. Several spectators exchanged quiet glances. It was the first time anyone in the courtroom had openly addressed the strange contradiction that had been sitting in front of them all morning. Judge Collins looked toward me as well. That is a reasonable question, she said calmly. I nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Langston crossed his arms, watching closely. Because if those documents were obtained improperly, he continued, the court may need to disregard them entirely. The implication hung quietly in the room. I did not rush to answer. Instead, I glanced briefly at Harold Whitaker beside me. The old man stood exactly as he had throughout the entire hearing. Calm, unhurried. His eyes met mine for a moment, and he gave a small nod. That was all. I turned back toward the bench. The documents were not obtained improperly, I said quietly. Langston raised an eyebrow. Then how exactly did you gain access to them? I rested my hands lightly on the table before speaking again. Mr. Whitaker provided them to me. Ethan immediately leaned forward in his chair. That is impossible, he said sharply. My grandfather barely understands how to use email. Harold Whitaker smiled faintly for the first time that morning. It was a small expression, but it carried a certain quiet amusement. Judge Collins noticed it as well. Mr. Whitaker, she said, would you like to respond to that? Harold cleared his throat gently. His voice was calm, steady, and far stronger than anyone might expect from a 72-year-old man standing in the middle of a courtroom. "I understand my business just fine," he said. Ethan opened his mouth as if preparing to argue again, but Harold continued before he could speak. "And I asked Daniel to help me organize those records." The name seemed to echo slightly in the quiet room. Victor Langston looked back at me, his eyes narrowing. "Daniel," he repeated slowly. "That is your first name, correct?" I nodded. Langston studied me for another long moment. The earlier amusement was completely gone now. What remained was something much sharper. The careful curiosity of a lawyer who had begun to realize that the man standing across from him might not be what he appeared to be at all. Victor Langston's eyes remained fixed on me after he repeated my name. The courtroom had fallen into a quiet that felt heavier than before, the kind of silence that appears when everyone realizes they may have missed something important. Judge Collins watched the exchange carefully. "Mr. Brooks," she said calmly, "the court would appreciate a clear explanation. You have assisted Mr. Whitaker in presenting financial records, contract histories, and internal business documents. Yet you appear here dressed as a maintenance employee of this building. That is an unusual situation." I nodded slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, it is." Victor Langston stepped forward again, though his voice carried far less confidence than earlier in the hearing. "Your Honor, I believe the court should clarify whether this individual is legally qualified to represent Mr. Whitaker. If he is not, then the material he presented could be challenged." Judge Collins turned her attention back to me. "That is a fair point. Mr. Brooks, are you formally representing Mr. Whitaker in this matter?" I paused for a moment before answering. "Yes, Your Honor." Langston gave a short laugh that sounded forced this time. "Then the court should also ask whether Mr. Brooks is licensed to practice law." Several people in the gallery leaned forward again. The earlier laughter from the beginning of the hearing felt like a distant memory now. Judge Collins folded her hands together. "Mr. Brooks, are you licensed to practice law in this state?" I met her gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." Langston immediately shook his head. "Your Honor, with respect, that claim requires proof." The judge nodded slightly. "It does." I reached into the inside pocket of the worn blue uniform I had been wearing all morning. The movement was slow and deliberate. From the pocket, I removed a small leather wallet and opened it carefully. Inside was a thin identification card. I walked forward and placed it on the clerk's desk so it could be delivered to the bench. The clerk carried it to Judge Collins. She studied it quietly for several seconds. Then she looked up again. The expression on her face had changed. Not dramatically, but enough that the shift was unmistakable. "Mr. Brooks," she said slowly, "this card identifies you as a member of the Illinois State Bar." A soft murmur moved through the spectators. Victor Langston's posture stiffened slightly. Judge Collins continued reading. "It also indicates that you previously served as a federal prosecutor for nearly 20 years. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Langston stared at me with open disbelief now. "That cannot be correct," he said quietly. The judge glanced at the card again before setting it on the bench. "According to this identification, Daniel Brooks served in the United States Attorney's Office until his retirement 5 years ago." The room seemed to absorb that information all at once. A few people exchanged surprised looks. Someone in the back whispered something under their breath. Victor Langston slowly exhaled as though recalculating every assumption he had made since the hearing began. Judge Collins turned her attention back to me. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "would you care to explain why a retired federal prosecutor is working as a janitor in this courthouse?" The question hung quietly in the room. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I glanced once more at Harold Whitaker standing beside the defense table. The old man gave the same small nod he had given earlier. I looked back at the judge. "After I retired," I said calmly, "I decided I wanted a quieter life. This building needed evening maintenance staff. The schedule suited me." Victor Langston shook his head slightly, still processing the revelation. "So the janitor in this courtroom," he said slowly, "is actually a former federal prosecutor." I nodded once. "Yes." The earlier laughter from the beginning of the hearing seemed almost unbelievable now. Judge Collins leaned back in her chair, studying the room carefully. "That certainly explains how you were able to present this case so effectively," she said. Across the courtroom, Ethan Whitaker sat perfectly still. The confidence he had carried into the hearing that morning had completely disappeared. Because the man he had dismissed as a janitor was not just someone who cleaned the courthouse floors. He was someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms exactly like this one, watching people underestimate him before everything changed. The weight of the revelation settled over the courtroom slowly, like dust after a door had been opened for the first time in years. Ethan Whitaker no longer leaned back with easy confidence. Instead, he sat rigid in his chair, his eyes moving between the judge, his lawyer, and the man he had dismissed earlier as nothing more than a janitor. Victor Langston remained standing for several seconds without speaking. For a lawyer who had built his reputation on control and precision, silence like this was unusual. Judge Collins finally broke the quiet. "Well," she said calmly, "that certainly clarifies the situation." She looked toward Victor Langston. "Again, Counselor, do you wish to continue arguing that Mr. Whitaker is incapable of managing his affairs?" Langston adjusted his tie slowly. The movement gave him time to consider his next words carefully. "Your Honor," he said at last, "my client brought this petition out of concern for his grandfather's future. It was never meant to become a spectacle." The judge raised an eyebrow slightly. "Yet that is exactly what it became." Langston gave a small nod, accepting the point. Ethan Whitaker suddenly leaned forward. "Your Honor, I was only trying to protect the company," he said quickly. "The market is changing. The business world moves fast. My grandfather built that company decades ago. I thought it was time for someone younger to take control before mistakes started happening." Harold Whitaker listened quietly before responding. "You did not ask to help," he said calmly. "You asked to take everything away." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Judge Collins studied both men for a moment before speaking again. "The purpose of this hearing," she said, "was to determine whether Harold Whitaker is mentally or legally incapable of managing his own financial and business decisions." She tapped the stack of documents that had been presented earlier. "Based on the evidence presented today, that claim has not been supported." Victor Langston slowly lowered his gaze. He understood exactly what the judge was about to say next. "In fact," Judge Collins continued, "the financial records and contract history demonstrate that Mr. Whitaker has been managing his company quite successfully." She paused briefly, allowing the statement to settle over the room. "Therefore, this court finds no legal basis to remove Mr. Whitaker's authority over his business or personal affairs." The words carried the quiet finality of a door closing. Ethan Whitaker sat back slowly, his face pale with disbelief. The plan he had entered the courtroom with that morning had collapsed piece by piece in front of everyone watching. Judge Collins then turned her attention toward me. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "while your choice of attire may have confused a few people today, the court appreciates the professionalism you demonstrated in presenting your client's case." I gave a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." Harold Whitaker placed a hand gently on the table as he looked across the room toward his grandson. His voice remained steady when he spoke again. "I built that company over 40 years, he said quietly. "Not just for profit, but for the people who depend on it." Ethan did not respond. Harold continued, his tone calm but firm. "One day you may be ready to lead it. But today you tried to take it without earning it." The words were not angry. They carried something heavier than anger. Disappointment. Judge Collins glanced toward the clerk. "This hearing is concluded." The sound of the gavel was soft but decisive. As people began to rise from their seats, the earlier laughter that had filled the room felt almost impossible to remember. Because the man many of them had dismissed as a quiet janitor had stood in the same place all morning, patiently allowing others to reveal far more about themselves than they ever intended.